Story number 1, the rear view mirror. I should never have looked in the rear view mirror that night, because what I saw there shouldn't exist in this world. My name is Carlos, and I work as a night taxi driver in Mexico City. I've been doing this for 5 years and I've seen everything on these dark streets, but nothing had prepared me for what I experienced that October dawn. It was 2:30 in the morning when I received a call to pick up a passenger in a neighborhood I didn't know very well. The streets were completely deserted and fog was beginning to form between the light pools, creating strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. I arrived at the indicated address, an old 2-story house with peeling paint and a completely neglected garden where plants grew wildly, forming disturbing shapes under the yellowish light of the street lamps. The woman who got into my taxi was young, maybe 25 years old. She had long, straight black hair that fell like a dark curtain over her face. She wore a black coat that seemed too big for her thin figure, and when she gave me the destination address, her voice sounded strangely hollow, as if it came from far away. She asked me to take her to San Miguel Cemetery, a place that's on the outskirts of the city and that at those hours is completely closed. I explained that I wouldn't be able to enter, but she insisted, saying she only needed to get to the main entrance. During the first minutes of the trip, everything seemed normal. She remained silent, looking out the window while I navigated through the empty streets. But as we moved away from the city center, I began to feel a strange sensation of cold that had nothing to do with the weather. It was then when I decided to take a look in the rearview mirror to check that my passenger was okay, and what I saw froze the blood in my veins. In the mirror was not reflected a young woman, but an elderly woman with a cadaverous appearance with grayish and wrinkled skin, eyes sunken in their sockets that shone with a whitish and unnatural light, and her mouth open in a horrible smile that revealed black and decayed teeth. Her hair was no longer black and silky, but gray and brittle, and her hands that before seemed normal now were bony with long yellowish nails that slowly scratched the leather seat. The horror paralyzed me completely, but I managed to maintain control of the steering wheel. I decided not to turn back to confirm what I was seeing, because a part of me knew that if I did, something terrible was going to happen. The rest of the trip passed in sepulchral silence while I fought against the panic that threatened to take over me. Every time I looked in the mirror, the image became more grotesque and disturbing. The old woman began to move her lips, as if she were whispering something, but I couldn't hear the words, only a constant and annoying buzz that seemed to come from all directions. When we finally arrived at the cemetery, the temperature in the car had dropped so much that I could see my own breath. I told the woman we had arrived, and I heard her normal voice respond with a simple thank you. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, the image of the cadaverous old woman was still there, now with completely white eyes and an even wider smile. I heard the sound of the back door opening and closing, but when I finally gathered the courage to turn around, the seat was empty and there was no trace that anyone had been there, except for a wet and dark stain in the place where she had sat and a smell of wet earth and dead flowers that impregnated my taxi for weeks. The most disturbing of all was when I checked the call history from that night and discovered that there was no record of any service request at that time. And when I returned the next day to the address where I had picked her up, the neighbors told me that house had been abandoned for more than 10 years, and that the last person who lived there was an elderly woman named Elena who died alone and wasn't found until several days later. Since that night, I stopped working as a night taxi driver, but I still have nightmares where I see that horrible smile reflected in the rearview mirror of any car I travel in. And sometimes, when I drive at night, I avoid looking in the mirrors too long because I'm terrified of seeing those white eyes and that smile that haunts me since that cursed dawn. Story number 2, the infinite highway. There are roads that shouldn't exist on any map, and I had the misfortune of finding one of them. I'm on a life insurance saleswoman, and because of my work, I have to travel constantly between cities. I always drive at night to avoid daytime traffic and arrive early to my appointments. But that November night, something went terribly wrong with my usual route. I had left Guadalajara heading to Leon as I had done hundreds of times before. I knew every curve, every town, every gas station on the way. But approximately at 11 at night, after passing through a small town called San Pedro, I realized that the traffic signs had disappeared and the highway looked different, narrower, and with asphalt that looked older and cracked. At first, I thought I had taken a detour by mistake, maybe due to construction of some new section. But when I tried to check my GPS, I discovered that the screen showed only gray static, and the cell phone had no signal at all, as if I were in an area completely isolated from the world. The highway stretched straight ahead without any visible curve. The light poles were irregularly spaced, and many of them flickered, creating a disturbing strobe effect that hurt the eyes. On the sides of the road, I could only see open field covered by a thick fog that moved unnaturally, forming figures that seemed to watch me as I advanced. I drove for what seemed like hours without finding any intersection, any sign, any other sign of civilization. Just that endless highway that disappeared into the darkness. And the most disturbing thing was that the speedometer marked 80 kilometers per hour, but I had the sensation of moving very slowly, as if time itself had become distorted. I began to feel growing anxiety when I realized that the gas level hadn't dropped even a millimeter despite having driven for so long. And when I looked at the dashboard clock, I saw that it still marked 11:15 at night, exactly the same time I had seen when I first noticed that something was wrong. I tried to stop on the shoulder to check the car and try to locate myself, but when I pressed the brake, the vehicle didn't respond. The pedals sank to the bottom without offering any resistance, and the car continued advancing at the same constant speed, as if it were being dragged by an invisible force. Panic began to take over me when I tried to turn the steering wheel to get off the road, but it didn't respond either. My hands moved, but the steering remained fixed, directing me inexorably forward on that highway that seemed to have no end. It was then when I began to see the figures on the sides of the road more clearly. They were human silhouettes walking in the opposite direction, but when the headlights illuminated them completely, I could see that they had no face, just a smooth white surface where their features should be, and they all wore the same dark clothing that seemed to wave without wind. I tried to scream, but no sound came from my throat, as if the air itself had become solid, and when I tried to use the horn, I discovered that it didn't work either. I was completely isolated in that bubble of silence, while those faceless figures continued appearing more frequently on the sides of the road. Desperation consumed me when suddenly I saw a different light in the distance. It wasn't the yellowish light of the pools, but something brighter and white. As I got closer, I could distinguish that it was an old gas station with a neon sign that said "Last Stop" in blinking red letters. When I finally reached the place, the car stopped by itself in front of one of the pumps, and for the first time in hours I could move the steering wheel and open the door. I got out trembling and looked around, discovering that the gas station seemed abandoned for decades. The pumps were rusted and covered with weeds, the windows broken, and the roof partially collapsed. It was then when I heard a voice behind me asking if I needed to fill the tank. I turned around and saw an older man dressed in a faded blue uniform. His skin had a grayish tone, and when he smiled, I could see he was missing several teeth. But the most disturbing were his eyes, completely black like two deep wells. I told him I just wanted to return to the main highway, and he pointed to a dirt road that disappeared among the trees. He assured me that if I followed it, I would get where I needed to go. I got in the car that now responded normally and took that winding path through the vegetation until I finally saw the lights of the real highway. When I arrived in Lyon, it was 6 in the morning, and I had lost more than 7 hours. But the most inexplicable thing was when I checked the odometer, I discovered that I hadn't advanced a single kilometer since leaving San Pedro, as if that entire trip on the infinite highway had occurred in a place that doesn't exist in our world. And since that night, every time I pass through San Pedro on my way back, I make sure to do it during the day because I'm terrified of finding that detour again. That leads to nowhere. Story number 3, the following headlights. I never thought that some simple headlights in the rearview mirror could become the most terrifying experience of my life. My name is Mike, and I work as a heavy cargo truck driver. I've been traveling the highways of the entire country for 15 years, transporting merchandise from one city to another. I'm used to driving long distances during the early morning when there's less traffic and the highways are practically empty. But what happened to me on the highway that connects Monterrey with Saltillo marked me forever. It was a particularly cold and clear December night. The stars shone intensely in the cloudless sky, and the highway stretched straight and lonely in front of my truck loaded with industrial machinery. It was approximately 2 in the morning when I first noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror. Two bright white lights that seemed to maintain a constant distance behind me despite me going at the maximum speed allowed for heavy vehicles. At first I didn't give it importance. I thought it was another trucker doing the same route. But as the minutes passed, I began to feel uneasy because the vehicle never got closer or farther away. It simply stayed there as if it were following my movements with millimetric precision. I decided to reduce speed to allow it to pass me. But when I decreased to 60 kilometers per hour, the headlights also reduced their speed, maintaining the same distance. I tried to accelerate to where the load allowed me, and the headlights accelerated too. It was as if there was an invisible connection between my truck and that mysterious vehicle. The sensation of being followed intensified when I realized that despite the clarity of the lights, I couldn't distinguish the shape of the vehicle that produced them. I only saw those two bright points floating in the darkness like eyes that constantly watched me. I made the decision to detour at the next exit to see if the vehicle continued its way. But when I put on the right turn signal and began to take the exit ramp, the headlights also put on their turn signal and followed me. My heart began to beat faster because now I was sure that someone was following me deliberately. The ramp led to a small town I knew well. It was a quiet place with few streets and several places where I could stop if I needed help. But when I arrived at the town, I discovered that all the houses were dark and there wasn't a single light on. Not even the street lights worked. It was as if the place had been completely abandoned. The headlights continued following me through the empty streets of the town, always maintaining the same distance while I desperately searched for some police station or gas station where I could ask for help. But everything was closed and in darkness. I decided to return to the main highway, hoping to find some traffic officer or at least other vehicles that would give me a sense of security. But when I returned to the highway, I discovered that now there was absolutely no one else. Just my truck and those mysterious headlights that continued their silent pursuit. The situation became even more disturbing when I tried to communicate by radio with other truckers or with my company. But I only heard static and occasionally a distorted voice that seemed to repeat my name over and over with a tone that froze my blood. I drove for hours in a state of growing panic while the headlights followed me relentlessly. I tried all the maneuvers I knew to lose whoever was following me. I changed lanes abruptly, braked suddenly, accelerated to the maximum, but nothing worked. Those lights remained there as if they were magnetized to my vehicle. The most terrifying began when I realized that the headlights were gradually becoming brighter, so much that they began to hurt my eyes, even seeing them through the mirror. And along with the increase in intensity, one began to hear a deep and constant buzz that seemed to come from all directions, and that made the cabin windows vibrate. Desperate, I made a drastic decision and headed toward a rest area that I knew had 24-hour surveillance. If someone was following me with malicious intentions, at least there I would have witnesses and possibility of asking for help. When I arrived at the rest area and stopped next to other parked trucks, the headlights also stopped but maintained their position about 50 meters away. I got out of the cabin with trembling legs and headed toward the security office, but when I turned back, the headlights had completely disappeared. There was no trace of any vehicle, and the other truckers who were there told me they hadn't seen anyone following me. The security guard checked the surveillance cameras at the entrance and showed me the recordings. In them you could clearly see my truck arriving alone. There was no other vehicle behind me. But I knew what I had experienced, and the burn marks on my retinas from the intensity of those lights were real. That night, I slept in the truck cabin inside the rest area. But I couldn't really rest because every time I closed my eyes I saw those bright headlights and heard the deep buzz that seemed to call me from the darkness. The next day, I continued my route normally, but since then, every time I drive at night on lonely highways, I avoid looking too long in the rearview mirror because I'm terrified of seeing those lights again that followed me during the longest night of my life. And sometimes, in the most silent dawns, I can still hear that deep buzz that reminds me that there are things on the night roads that it's better not to find. Story number 4, the invisible passenger. There are seats in your car that should never be filled, and And that night, I learned why. My name is Sandra, and I work as a rideshare app driver, mainly during night shifts on weekends when rates are higher and I can earn better money. I know very well the streets of my city, and I'm used to dealing with all kinds of passengers, from drunk businessmen to university students returning home late. But I had never experienced anything like what happened during my last ride of the dawn. It was 3:40 in the morning when I received a ride request from the historic center of the city to a residential development on the outskirts. The passenger's name was Luis, and according to the app, he had rated the trip with 5 stars in advance, something that seemed strange to me, because usually ratings are given after the service. I arrived at the pickup point, which was in front of a bar that had already closed. The streets were completely deserted, and you could only hear the distant sound of some dogs barking and the buzzing of electrical cables above my head. I waited for 5 minutes with the hazard lights on, but I didn't see anyone approaching the car. I called the registered phone number, but it went straight to voicemail. I was about to cancel the trip when I clearly heard the sound of the back door opening and then closing with a dry thud. I looked in the rearview mirror expecting to see my passenger, but the back seat was completely empty. I thought maybe the door had opened from the wind and I checked it, but it was properly closed and the lock activated. I returned to the driver's seat feeling a strange sensation of cold that ran down my back as if someone had walked over my grave. I decided to start the trip because the app showed that the passenger was already on board and had confirmed the destination. I thought maybe there was an error in the system and that Luis had gotten into another car, but as I began to drive toward the indicated development, I started to notice disturbing things that I couldn't explain rationally. The first indication that something was terribly wrong was when the air conditioning stopped working and the temperature inside the car began to drop drastically, so much that I could see my own breath condensing in front of me. I checked the controls, but they were working normally according to the dashboard. However, the cold continued intensifying to the point where I began to shake uncontrollably. The second thing I noticed was a strange smell that began to fill the cabin. It was a mixture of wet earth, wilted flowers, and something more unpleasant that I couldn't identify, as if something was slowly decomposing. The smell became so intense that I had to open the windows despite the cold to be able to breathe normally. During the journey, I began to hear strange sounds coming from the back seat. It was as if someone was moving restlessly, the sound of fabric rubbing against the leather seats, and occasionally what seemed to be deep and melancholic sighs. But every time I looked in the rearview mirror, there was no one there, just the empty seat covered by the shadows created by the street lights. The experience became truly terrifying when we reached a particularly dark area of the road where the street lights were burned out. At that moment, I clearly heard a male voice coming from the back seat. A deep and hoarse voice that whispered my name, followed by the words, "Thank you for taking me home." Terror paralyzed me momentarily, but I managed to maintain control of the steering wheel while my heart beat so loud I could hear it in my ears. I tried to respond, asking if he was okay, but got no answer, just silence and that invisible presence that I could feel watching me from behind. It was as if there was someone sitting directly behind me, breathing on my neck. I could feel the warm air contrasting with the unnatural cold that had invaded the vehicle. When we finally arrived at the development, I followed the GPS directions to a 2-story house with completely dark windows and a neglected garden. I stopped in front of the entrance and waited for my invisible passenger to get out of the car, but nothing happened for several minutes. I finally gathered the courage to turn toward the back seat, and what I saw took my breath away. There was a clear depression in the seat, as if someone with considerable weight had been sitting there during the entire trip, and on the seat there were several drops of a dark liquid that hadn't been there when I started the trip. Panic completely dominated me, and I ran out of the car, leaving the keys in. I ran to the house and desperately knocked on the door, hoping someone would help me, but no one answered despite me continuing to knock for several minutes. When I finally returned to the car, the depression in the seat had disappeared, and there was no trace of the dark liquid. But the smell of wilted flowers and wet earth remained for days, no matter how many air fresheners I used or how many times I cleaned the interior. The most disturbing of all was when I checked the app the next day and discovered that there was no record of that trip. It didn't appear in my history, nor had I received any payment for the service. as if it had never happened. But when I investigated the address where I had left my invisible passenger, I discovered that house had belonged to a man named Luis Hernandez who had died in a car accident 3 years before, exactly on the corner where I had picked him up. Since that night, I stopped working the dawn shifts and I avoid that area of the city. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone through the dark streets, I feel that familiar presence in the back seat, and I hear the whisper of a voice thanking me for taking him home. And every time it happens, the cold returns, and that unmistakable smell fills my car, reminding me that there are passengers who never stop traveling, even after reaching their final destination.